From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The humanitarian situation is dire, with reports of denial of humanitarian access in some localities and looting of aid supplies by soldiers. An estimated 350,000 people are threatened by famine.
As Ethiopia faces the world's worst famine in a decade, the Ethiopian military bombs a marketplace in Tigray, killing at least 64 people. We'll speak to a leading Ethiopian journalist. Then Afghan President Ashraf Ghani is at the White House today as Taliban attacks surge ahead of the U.S. military pullout. Plus, we look at how a former president of the NRA was tricked into giving a graduation speech in front of over 3,000 empty white chairs, one chair for each high school student who could not graduate this year because they were killed by gun violence.
There are some who continue to fight to gut the Second Amendment, but I'd be willing to bet that many of you will be among those who stand up and prevent them from succeeding.
We'll go to Parkland, Florida, to speak with Manuel Oliver, co-founder of Change the Ref, about how he pulled off the stunt. His son Joaquim was shot dead in the 2018 massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Biden says he's reached a deal with senators on a bipartisan infrastructure spending bill that would significantly roll back the White House's original $2.2 trillion American Jobs Plan. Biden's announcement capped bipartisan talks led by Arizona Democratic Senator Kyrsten Sinema and Republican Rob Portman of Ohio.
I clearly didn't get all I wanted. They gave more than I think maybe they were inclined to give in the first place. But this reminds me of the days we used to get an awful lot done up in the United States Congress. We actually worked with one. We had bipartisan deals. Bipartisan deals mean compromise.
The White House says the emerging deal does not include any new taxes. It would see the U.S. spend $579 billion on new infrastructure over 5 years, with some $300 billion going to transportation and $100 billion earmarked for roads, bridges, and other major projects. It does not include funding for major programs championed by progressives, including investments in green energy jobs and funds to combat the climate crisis. Top Democrats, including President Biden and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, say they will not support a compromise infrastructure bill unless senators first pass a reconciliation bill containing Democratic priorities. The Biden administration's backing the Trump administration's approval of the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. On Wednesday, the Justice Department argued in a legal filing that an Army Corps of Engineers permitting process followed its legal obligations to consider the pipeline's environmental impacts. If completed, Line 3 would carry more than 750,000 barrels of Canadian tar sands oil a day across Indigenous land and fragile ecosystems. An Anishinaabe activist, Winona LaDuke, responded in a statement, quote, "This is a racist pipeline project forced down the throats of our people, an ecological time bomb, and a giveaway to a Canadian multinational oil interest. If the president is genuine in his pledge to take climate justice and tribal rights seriously, his administration must stop defending the Trump administration's decision and undertake a genuine analysis of Line 3's environmental and human impacts," Winona LaDuke said. To see our full interview with her, you can go to democracynow.org. Meanwhile, protests and direct actions against Line 3 continue in northern Minnesota. This week, water protectors locked themselves to a horizontal drill Enbridge is using to bore under the Straight River. One water protector barricaded themselves inside the drill operating vehicle. An unprecedented heat wave, fueled by the climate crisis, is set to bring dangerously high record temperatures to the Pacific Northwest. Seattle will be hotter than Miami this weekend, with forecasters predicting it could reach 106 degrees Fahrenheit on Monday. Portland, Oregon could see a record-shattering 113 degrees Fahrenheit. In Canada, Vancouver Island is expected to break all-time record highs that in turn were broken last Monday. The National Interagency Fire Center warns surging demand for firefighters and equipment could soon outstrip fire crews' ability to battle blazes as an unprecedented drought worsens in the western United States. The Federal Fire Agency says nearly 9,000 firefighters are currently battling 47 large conflagrations. There have been over 29,000 wildfires across the U.S. so far this year, about 4,000 more than would be expected at this point in an average year. The European Parliament has voted in favor of a landmark climate law that commits the European Union to reaching climate neutrality by 2050 and reducing net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. This is Swedish lawmaker Jutta Guteland.
Today is a historic day. Today we will enshrine into law that EU, which started as a coal and steel union more than 70 years ago, will become the first carbon-neutral continent by 2050 at the latest.
But climate activists say the law does not go nearly far enough. A statement from a bloc of Green Party lawmakers said, quote, "It's simply not enough to limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, let alone the 1.5 degrees Celsius that climate scientists say we need to achieve. What's on the table now are half measures and broken promises," they said. In Madagascar, the UN's World Food Program warns the climate crisis has pushed over 1 million people to the very edge of starvation, as Madagascar has seen a series of severe droughts. Head of the World Food Program, David Beasley, noted Madagascar has not contributed to the global climate disaster, yet is suffering some of its most devastating effects. This is Tamaria describing her family has been surviving, how they've been surviving the drought.
In the morning, I prepare this plate of insects. I clean them up as best as I can, given the near total absence of water. It's been 8 months that my children and I have been eating this plant every day, and exclusively because we have nothing else to eat and no rain to allow us to harvest what we have sown.
In Canada, at least 751 unmarked graves have been found at a former boarding school for First Nation children in Saskatchewan. The graves were found near the site of the now-demolished Marieville Indian Residential School. This is Cowessess First Nation Chief Cadmus Delam speaking at a news conference Thursday.
We all must put down our ignorance and accidental racism of not addressing the truth that this country has with Indigenous people. We are not asking for pity, but we are asking for understanding. We didn't remove these headstones. Removing headstones is a crime in this country, and we are treating this like a crime scene at the moment.
The graves were found just weeks after the bodies of 215 Indigenous children on the grounds of the Kamloops Residential School in British Columbia were discovered. Some 150,000 Indigenous children attended Canadian government-funded boarding schools, which were established in the 19th century and run by the Catholic Church. Many children were ripped from their families and sent to the schools, which were found to be rife with abuse and neglect. Canada's 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission said the schools were committing cultural genocide. Public pressure is now mounting to hold the Catholic Church accountable for its atrocities and to remove monuments to Canadian leaders involved in the genocide of First Nations people. The U.S. is banning the import of solar panel materials that are manufactured in Xinjiang, China, which the U.S. says is made by forced labor of the Muslim Uyghur minority. The U.S. added 5 companies to its import and export blacklist over the human rights concerns. China is the largest global provider of parts for solar power. Cotton and tomato products from Xinjiang are also prohibited following bans issued during the Trump administration. In Florida, at least 4 people are dead and 99 others remain unaccounted for after a 12-story condominium near Miami Beach suddenly collapsed early Thursday morning. Rescue crews used dogs and earth-moving equipment to sift through the building's wreckage, freeing dozens of survivors trapped beneath a massive pile of rubble. The high-rise apartment in the town of Surfside was built in 1981 and was undergoing a required 40-year recertification process. It was due to undergo repairs for rusted steel and damaged concrete. It's not known if saltwater corrosion or neglect played a role in its sudden collapse just after 1 a.m. Thursday. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi will create a select committee to investigate the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol by a pro-Trump mob of thousands incited by the former president and his allies. Pelosi moved to create the panel 4 weeks after Senate Republicans, led by Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, blocked a bill to create an independent bipartisan commission on the Capitol insurrection.
Again, January 6th was one of the darkest days in our nation's history. I've said it now 3 times. It is imperative that we establish the truth of that day and ensure that an attack of that kind cannot happen and that we root out the causes of it all.
In Michigan, a Republican-led state Senate committee has published a report systematically debunking claims of voter fraud made by former President Trump and his allies in the Republican Party. The 55-page document concludes there was, quote, no evidence of widespread or systematic fraud, unquote, in the 2020 election, and discredits conspiracy theories advanced by Trump's lawyer Rudy Giuliani that hundreds of dead people voted, that voting machines were hacked, or that hundreds of thousands of illegal votes were cast. However, the Michigan Senate committee, Republicans, used the report to promote voting changes that would make it harder for people to vote by absentee ballot. A New York state court has temporarily suspended Rudy Giuliani's law license, citing his lies about the 2020 election. The court found there's, quote, uncontroverted evidence that Giuliani communicated demonstrably false and misleading statements to courts, lawmakers, and the public at large in his capacity as lawyer for former President Donald J. Trump and the Trump campaign, unquote. Giuliani railed against the court's ruling Thursday.
I mean, I might as well be in Iran or East Germany before the change. This is a one-sided decision.
In Minneapolis, a judge is delivering the sentence today for former police officer convicted murderer Derek Chauvin. Prosecutors are seeking a 30-year prison sentence. Chauvin was convicted in April of murdering George Floyd on May 25, 2020. Floyd's death sparked a national and global uprising against police violence and racism. The UN warns the pandemic has increased the vulnerability of children in conflict zones who are at the heightened risk of abduction, recruitment to fight, and sexual violence. In 2020, at least 8,400 children were killed or harmed in wars. Save the Children said the UN report left out many perpetrators of grave violations against children, including Ethiopia, Israel, and the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition waging war on Yemen, which killed 200 children last year. And in the occupied West Bank, protesters decried the apparent killing of activist Nizar Banat after he was arrested and beaten by Palestinian Authority forces. Banat was an outspoken critic of the Palestinian Authority and its president, Mahmoud Abbas. This is his widow, Jahan Banat.
What are they killing us for? They will not kill all the Palestinians. Palestinians are not afraid of Israeli occupation soldiers. Will they be afraid of the Palestinian Authority and its forces? They will not be afraid. I call on all Palestinians to be like Nizar Banat.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Ethiopia, a country being torn apart by war and famine. On Tuesday, the Ethiopian military bombed a marketplace in the Tigray region, killing at least 64 people in one of the deadliest attacks since government forces invaded the region last November. The Ethiopian military has claimed all the victims were combatants, a claim disputed by witnesses on the ground. The bombing came just a day after Ethiopians voted in national and regional elections, but polls could not open in some regions due to ongoing fighting. The country is still waiting for results which will determine if the ruling coalition, led by the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, stays in power. The conflict in Tigray has killed thousands of civilians, displaced more than 2 million people, and led to massive food shortages, with aid groups warning 350,000 people are on the brink of starvation. The United Nations is urging the Ethiopian government to allow more humanitarian aid into Tigray. We're joined right now by the Ethiopian journalist Tsedala Lema. She is the founder of the Addis Standard, an English-language monthly magazine based in Ethiopia. She has a new opinion piece in the New York Times headlined, "He Promised Peace, Then He Tore His Country Apart." It's about the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who won the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize. So the latest news out of Tigray, Tsedala, is two issues, is the famine it faces and this latest Ethiopian bombing of a marketplace that killed over 60 people. Can you talk about what you understand happened?
Both the famine, good morning, Amy, and thanks for having me. Both the famine and the bombing are not separate things from what has been happening in Tigray for the last 8 months. The war, they began in November, on November 4th, in what Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said was a very short operation to apprehend members of, or what he called the criminal cliques of the TPLF, which is the party that was administering the Tigray regional state. So this operation, law enforcement operation, as it was called initially, has morphed into a civil war, which has gone into now this horrific outcome of a war that displaced, as you said, more than 2 million. Thousands are dead. We don't know the death toll yet. The war is not ending. There is no end in sight for that. And 350,000, more than 350,000 civilians in famine zone, according to the UN. So the bombing came on top of that, which is on Tuesday. The military is saying the targets were combatants. But all information coming from the region, including reports that we have filed, indicate that this was a market, airstrike on a market, and the victims are civilians, including infant children there. The army still maintains that the target were combatants, and there is no explanation as to why the pictures of civilians are emerging if we go by the army's interpretation of things. So this is the cumulative effect of the war that has been going on in Tigray for 8 months.
So can you talk about this bombing in particular and the fact that the Ethiopian military has admitted that it engaged in the bombing? And what is the cause of the Ethiopian attack on Tigray and the use of Eritrean soldiers, sometimes disguised as Ethiopian soldiers, in the mass killing?
Well, these are two separate. The immediate cause of the bombing is not clear yet, but from what we get, the last few days, there has been a renewed fighting between the Tigray Defense Forces, as they have now renamed themselves. These are military armed people that belong to the Tigray regional state. And the federal forces that are backed by the Eritrean Defense Forces. So there has been some sort of calm over the past few weeks, but there is a renewed conflict now, and officials from the Tigray, the ousted Tigray regional state government, are saying they have regrouped now, and they are attacking what they call enemy posts. So there is a renewed fighting happening, which is far from the government's assertion that the fighting is over. The government said on November 28th that the operation, the rule enforcement operation, was over already, but it didn't. So there is a renewed conflict. So we don't know if this bombing of a marketplace has to do with the loss the Ethiopian Defense Forces are facing, because that's what the Tigrayan government officials, the ones that have been ousted by the federal government, are saying that the federal army is sustaining losses. So what triggered it is yet to be investigated. We don't know. And how it is that a marketplace is targeted where civilians are the obvious casualties. So this is the background to the bombing. But the general background to the war is inherently a political difference that morphed into a political violence, a military violence. The precursor to that is an election that the Tigray regional state has unilaterally conducted in September after the federal government decided to postpone the general election that took place this week because of the COVID reason. So the regional state defied that, and they said they would like to have their unilateral election for the regional council. So they had that election in September 9th of last year. So relations between the two, between the federal government and the regional state in Tigray, deteriorated badly after that election took place. And in October, the Ethiopian House of Federation, the Speaker of the Ethiopian Upper Parliament, has came up with an idea that he said there is a constitutional means that we are exploring to oust the regional government that is elected by the Tigrayan people in September, and have a military intervention, a police intervention in the region. So relations after that was war between the two was a matter of when, it was not a matter of if. So preparations were intensified after that, and that culminated into the war that began on the 4th of November. The federal government said it was taken by surprise. It was responding to an attack on the Northern Command Force, which is the military's command force that was in Tigray regional state. So federal government says that was attacked, and its response to its military response to the regional state, there was in response to the attack against the command post that was located in the capital of the Tigray regional state. But all evidence indicates that the preparation for this war was already underway, including the involvement of the Eritrean government. Because on the 1st of November, the Eritrean president has already declared, released a statement, what looked like a declaration of war against the Tigrayan regional state. Now, Tigray regional state happens to be now the common enemy between the federal government led by Abiy Ahmed and the Eritrean dictator Isaias Afwerki. So here is where we are 8 months down the line. Tigray destroyed, women gang raped. In fact, sexual assault is being used as a weapon of war, including hunger being used as a weapon of war. A lot of other sorts of war crimes being committed in Tigray regional state as we speak. So the initial cause is that political disagreement between the federal government and the Tigray regional state.
You write in your New York Times op-ed piece, he promised peace, then he tore his country apart, saying the war in Tigray, though exceptional in its brutality, is not an isolated case. Can you give us the history of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who amazingly won the Nobel Peace Prize just 2 years ago in 2019. Your response at the time, since you talk about this not being isolated, and what that means for today in the midst of this election.
Yeah, so Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was a largely unknown figure 3 years ago. He came to the helm after the previous regime, which is a coalition of 4 major parties and 5 other small periphery parties, almost collapsed under the weight of an incessant protest by the Oromo, the Amhara, and also other minority groups in the southern region of the Ethiopian Federation. So after 4.5 years of incessant protest against the previous regime, what we call the EPRDF regime, EPRDF decided that it was about time it changes leadership, It was about time it reforms itself and saves itself from the tide of the public protest. So Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came on the back of that protest, particularly in Oromia regional state, where the protest had first started in April of 2014. It went on until 2018 when he came. So he came to the power by the decision of the ruling party, which he then quickly dismantled after he came to power. So this is the background of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. He was a key part of the party that he dismantled, the EPRDF, the party that was dominated by the Tigray, the TPLF, which is now at war with the federal government, with the army of the federal government. And so when he embarked upon changing or reforming that party that was collapsing under the weight of popular protest, what he did was to implement those directions put in place by the EPRDF. One of those directions were creating or normalizing relations with Eritrea, the neighboring state, with which Ethiopia did not have peace or war for 20 years prior to that. So they wanted to normalize the relationship, and he got embarked on that. But instead, what he did was normalize relations between himself and the Eritrean dictator Isaias Afwerki. The relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea did not take any form, any institutionalized form for that matter. In fact, the Ethiopian parliament did not even approve what kind of peace pact that the prime minister has signed with dictator Isaias Afwerki in Saudi Arabia. So we don't know what's included in this peace pact. So 2 years down the line, Eritrea finds itself deeply involved in the war against the Tigrayan government in the north. So the Nobel Peace Prize was given to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed barely a year after he initiated this normalization of relationship about which we don't know nothing. And the rest of the world also don't know anything about it. But there was a lot of photobombing. There was a lot of ecstatic moments in this normalization of relations. But deep inside, it is now looking like it was a pact against the Tigrayan government in Tigray, which is neighboring the Eritrea. Eritrea has a long-standing grievances against the TPLF, because TPLF was at the helm of the regime that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed dismantled. And during that time, Ethiopia had this 2-year war, 1998-2000, in which Eritrea was defeated, and a peace agreement did not hold because Eritrea didn't get the land, the disputed land. It was decided to Eritrea by an international arbiters. Eritrea did not get that. So there's a bitter relationship between the TPLF and the Eritrean regime in Asmara. So it was a payback time for Isaias Afwerki to go and get the TPLF leadership, who have humiliated his forces in the war in 98-2000. So this is a pact between the two, targeting a common enemy. That's the background of the coming into power of Abiy Ahmed, which has now morphed into him being a Nobel Peace Prize winner, presiding over one of the most devastating civil wars in Ethiopia.
On Monday, UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet said she was deeply disturbed by continued reports of human rights violations in Tigray.
The humanitarian situation is dire, with reports of denial of humanitarian access in some localities and looting of aid supplies by soldiers. An estimated 350,000 people are threatened by famine.
Speaking to the BBC, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed denied that there's famine in Tigray.
There is no hunger in Tigray. There is a problem in Tigray, and the government is capable of fixing that.
There's no hunger in Tigray. Let's talk about that situation and the accusation by so many that aid is being blocked from getting to those in need, and the extent of the famine.
Well, you know, multiple reports from the ground, reports from humanitarian agencies, largely under the United Nations, attest to the devastating situation of the humanitarian crisis there. And the number, I mean, there are people dying as we speak of hunger. In fact, the first report of people dying of lack of food came out in January, as far back as January, by a local authority which was instituted by the federal government. There is an interim government now that's trying to govern Tigray regional state. So an official of this interim government has already said 13 people have died of lack of food. That is in January. So things have only deteriorated since January. Nothing has improved. So the UN estimates this much number are now in famine zone. And the Prime Minister clearly says there is no hunger in Tigray. And that's the crux of it, the denial. The denial and the lack of humility in recognizing that people are dying as we speak, because they cannot eat. And this lack of admitting to the role of the Eritrean forces there, who the UN clearly identified as culprits of forces that are deliberately denying people access to food. They are also denying farmers from plowing, because Tigray is home to the peasants. It's a peasantry zone, and it's a farming season now. And if they do not farm their lands now, there will be an extended famine in the region.
In these last 30 seconds, what can be done, Sadala?
Well, you know, Tigray is not the only problem Ethiopia is facing today. The Prime Minister has massively mismanaged this transition, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Oromia is also another region now which is experiencing a rebels movement, Benishangul regional state, Amhara regional state. They're all under some form of government crackdown, and they all trace back their differences to a political difference. So what we need now is to try to look into this politically and try to find political way out of it. This, you cannot do it by jailing your opponents, dissidents, and by bombing your critics and your dissidents. You cannot do this. You can only do this by having a political solution. The Prime Minister thinks now he may have a mandate as an elected Prime Minister, but what he's going to do after that is going to define his term in the office, whether he will return back to the reform and have a democratic process in motion, or whether he wants to continue jailing his critics, killing and bombing is, the region that refused to submit to his rule. So the only way out of this is a political solution.
Sadala Lema, I want to thank you so much for being with us from outside Frankfurt, Germany, journalist and the founder of the Addis Standard, an English-language monthly magazine based in Ethiopia. We'll link to her piece in the New York Times about the Ethiopian Prime Minister, headlined, "He Promised Peace, Then He Tore His Country Apart." Coming up, the Afghan president is visiting the White House today as Taliban attacks surge during the U.S. military pullout. Stay with us. By Wendy Mack. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. President Biden's meeting with Afghan President Ashraf Ghani at the White House today as the Taliban seizes more districts in Afghanistan in the midst of the U.S. military pullout set to end on September 11th. Biden's pledge to withdraw those troops then, just under 20 years after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. The Taliban reportedly now holds twice as much of Afghanistan as it did 2 months ago. On Tuesday, the Taliban captured Afghanistan Afghanistan's main border crossing with Tajikistan. The Wall Street Journal is reporting the U.S. intelligence community has concluded the government of Afghanistan could collapse within 6 months of the U.S. withdrawal. The Associated Press is reporting the U.S. is planning to keep 650 troops in Afghanistan after the September 11th deadline to provide diplomatic security and to assist Turkish troops to protect the Kabul airport. The U.S. is also looking for nearby military bases which could be used to carry out future aerial bombings and other operations. Meanwhile, Thursday, the White House confirmed it plans to evacuate 18,000 Afghan translators and others who worked for U.S. forces. To talk more about the crisis in Afghanistan, we're joined by Afghan-American Professor Zahar Wahab. He was born in Afghanistan, recently taught at American University of Afghanistan in Kabul. He's joining us from Portland, Oregon. Professor, thanks so much for being with us. Can you talk about the meeting today, what you expect Ashraf Ghani wants from this meeting, the president of Afghanistan, and this news report that his government will collapse within 6 months of the U.S. withdrawal?
Yes. Good morning, Amy, and thank you for having me. President Ashraf Ghani and his entourage of 10 people, which includes his wife, apparently, met with Senator Mitch McConnell yesterday and Senator Risch, urging them to ask the White House to extend, its withdrawal and keep its commitment to preserving the Afghan government. From what I understand, President Ashraf Ghani is behaving more and more like a king and assuming more and more power, and therefore it seems like he is terribly isolated, out of touch, and without much support. The delegation he has with him are the usual people, 4 women, including his wife, and 6 or 7 men from his administration mostly. And in Afghanistan, there's already talk about the not representative nature of the delegation. Apparently, Mr. Ghani was trying for months to meet with President Biden alone. But President Biden was telling him, no, I will not meet you alone. You have to come to D.C. With a broad-based, representative, inclusive delegation. And yet, this delegation is not broad-based and not very inclusive, and it's the usual people that he tried to use. So I think, as you pointed out, the situation in Afghanistan seems to be unraveling rather fast. There's fighting going on in most of the provinces. The Taliban have captured almost a fourth of the 400 districts in the country, circling many of the major cities like Mazar-e-Sharif and even Kabul. The speculation is that the Taliban are getting ready for assaulting the major cities. And so I think President Ghani is going to be asking the White House for a stronger, deeper, and more extended commitment because the Afghan National Defense Forces are unable to even protect their own bases. There is speculation, there is observation, that in many cases the Afghan troops are either deserting or giving up and giving their weapons and so forth, all of the American-supplied weapons to the Taliban or joining the Taliban in some cases. And so the other thing that is happening in Afghanistan is that in many parts of the country, because there really has not been an effective government, a government that can provide peace, security.
We're going to reconnect and go to the UN refugee chief, Filippo Grandi, who said last week that the United Nations is preparing for a likely further displacement of civilians in Afghanistan after U.S. and international troops leave the country.
With the withdrawal of the international troops, this is possibly or likely going to become worse, and therefore we are doing contingency planning inside the country for further displacement and in neighboring countries in case people might cross borders.
And at the end of a White House press briefing on Thursday, a reporter questioned President Biden about whether the U.S. would protect Afghan interpreters who aided American troops.
Do you know anything on these reports about moving Afghan nationals to other countries who helped during the war?
They're going to come. We've already begun the process. Those who helped us are not going to be left behind.
Do you know what country they're going to move to first?
I don't know that. I'll be meeting with with Ghani tomorrow. He's coming to my office. That'll be discussion, but they're welcome here, just like anyone else who risked their lives to help us.
And Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby said Tuesday that the schedule for pulling out remaining troops in Afghanistan may change, though at this point the September 11th deadline remains.
As the Secretary has said, the withdrawal is on pace. It is a dynamic situation, and we've said that from the very beginning, which means that he and the chairman, General McKenzie, are constantly looking at the pace we're going at and the capabilities we have and the capabilities that we're going to need throughout to complete the withdrawal. And so, as we've said from the very beginning, while there is a schedule, we are mindful that that schedule could fluctuate and change as conditions change too.
We're going to go to break and then return to the Afghan professor, and then a remarkable moment in the gun control movement when the former head of the NRA is tricked into giving speech to 3,000 empty white chairs to signify, well, he didn't know it at the time, the more than 3,000 high school children who won't graduate this year because they died in gun violence. Stay with us.
Something that he hasn't even done. Smart is ruining my life, and I'm sorry they've done all they hide behind the lies of everyone. In the end, good, we all have it up above. Perpetual perish in the depths of hell. How could hell be anyone? Rise up, something good. Armageddon, this is hell. Armageddon, this is hell. Armageddon, is hell.
Bad Religion here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we return for the last minute to Zahar Wahab, the Afghan-American professor, who is speaking to us from Portland, Oregon, as Ashraf Ghani is preparing to meet with President Biden at the White House. Finally, on this issue that you were talking about of the Afghan government possibly collapsing in 6 months, there's a large coalition in the United States from Republican to Democrat to the Pentagon that didn't want the U.S. to pull out. And it's hard to separate propaganda put out by them that the country, Afghanistan, will collapse if the U.S. pulls out from the actual fact of the matter. Your response to this as an Afghan living in the United States, Professor Wahab?
Well, I think it's not just the intelligence community here in the U.S. giving the Afghan government just between 6 and 12 months, but if you talk to the Afghans on the ground, there in fact has not been a real government, an effective government in Afghanistan for some time now. If you talk about, peace, safety, security, food, electricity, drinking water, schools, law and order, etc., none of these really exist. And the Afghans have been desperately crying for peace and stability and normalcy. And yet, with the American forces and the Afghan government forces, there has been no peace and stability and security. So, and now there's talk about perhaps leaving 650 troops behind to protect the Kabul airport, but also flying these 15,000 plus Afghans who work with the Americans to Guam and then process their visas. Just think about what this indicates. What it indicates is that both Washington and the Afghan government have realized that things are at a critical point. I mean, Afghanistan is really on the brink. It could fall apart. And the hope is, the idea is that these few troops and maybe the Turks will save the day. At the same time, we know that the so-called Doha peace talks have collapsed, and there's not even a mention of the conference that was supposed to take place between the different factions parts in Istanbul. So I think Afghanistan is really on the brink, and I would say that we very quickly install a UN peacekeeping force and then worry about these other things. Right now, 600 more troops, or 6,000, they're not going to save the country.
Afghan-American professor Zahar Wahab speaking to us from Portland, Oregon. We'll see what happens at this meeting between President Ghani of Afghanistan and President Biden, and we'll report on it next week. Professor Wahab recently taught at the University of Afghanistan in Kabul, joining us from Portland, Oregon. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. As we end today's show looking at how the parents of a student killed in the 2018 massacre at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida tricked a former president of the National Rifle Association into giving a high school graduation speech defending gun rights in front of 3,044 empty white chairs, one chair for each student who could not graduate this year because they were killed by gun violence. David Keene, who still serves on the NRA board, thought he was giving a rehearsal speech for graduating students at the James Madison Academy at Las Vegas. But no such school exists. The stunt was organized by the group Change the Ref, which was founded by Manuel and Patricia Oliver, whose son Joaquim, or Guac, was shot dead in the Parkland, Florida massacre in 2018 in his high school. This week, the group released this video of David Keene's remarks in front of thousands of empty chairs in Las Vegas, a warning to our audience. His words are interspersed with the sounds of 911 calls of students trapped at schools with active shooters.
David Keene was the two-time president of the National Rifle Association. He continues to be a staunch defender of your Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Therefore, it is my privilege to introduce to you David Keene.
Let me begin by telling you what an honor it is to be here to help celebrate your graduation. Picture for a minute the young James Madison, for whom this school is named. This year, you focused on one of the most important of Madison's amendments, the Second Amendment. There are some who continue to fight to gut the Second Amendment, but I'd be willing to bet that many of you will be among those who stand up and prevent them from succeeding.
911 is emergency.
Defending it is a challenge and a duty that Americans like you
You're shooting into my classroom.
who understand what has made the country the envy of the world must accept as their own.
Okay, is anybody injured? Yes, a lot of blood. Please help, please.
An overwhelming majority of you will go on to college, while others may decide their dream dictates a different route to success.
School. Okay, do you know how many people are injured?
So my advice to you is simple enough. Follow your dream and make it a reality.
My son is in Stoneman Douglas. My daughter just texted me from school. She's at Stoneman Douglas.
And never for a minute doubt that you can achieve that dream. Thank you.
Video produced by the gun reform group Change the Ref, which tricked the former president of the NRA into giving this graduation speech in front of 3,044 empty white chairs, one chair for each student who would have been a high school senior this year, who will not graduate because they were killed by gun violence. The group also tricked John Lott Jr., the author of More Guns, Less Crime, to give a similar speech. We're joined now by Manuel Oliver, co-founder of Change the Ref. His son, Joaquin, was one of 17 people killed in their own high school in 2018 at the mass shooting there at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Manny, thanks so much for being with us. What you have portrayed in this, I don't even want to call it a stunt, this incredible action, this demonstration of what gun violence means in this country, unique in the world. Talk about what you did.
Well, thank you, Amy, for having us here today. Well, this is our latest campaign. You know what we've been doing for the last 3 years, and we did something different this time. We actually confronted these leaders, members of the NRA, and representing the gun industry for decades. So we are very pleased with the results. You have no idea how many emails and text messages of support coming to my computer per minute. Like, it's incredible. I think that we need to do this more often, because it shows that the NRA, the gun industry, and the gun lobby are not as powerful as they say. And on the other hand, it also represents the amount of power that parents of victims can show and have. More, I'm pretty sure, that enjoyed that moment when we were able to show the truth without any editing. There was no need for that. These guys are repeating their own words. This is what they believe, and this is what they have been repeating for decades. And I don't know in how many acts like this one with actual kids sitting down.
So as part of this action that you engaged in, and it's truly amazing, for those listening on radio, the shot from above of the thousands of empty chairs is really astounding. You also invited John Lott Jr., who accepted the invitation to speak at the fake graduation ceremony. I want to play that clip.
John Lott is an economist, educator, and scholar. He has authored several books, including More Guns, Less Crime, often referred to as the Bible of the National Rifle Association. It is my privilege to introduce to you Dr. John Lott.
Congratulations. You all have made a new stage in life. You know, your school is named after James Madison, and he proposed what became the Second Amendment to the Constitution, that there's an individual right to people to be able to keep guns for protection. Can you name me one place in the world, any place in the world, that's banned either all guns or all handguns and seen murder rates go down? I can't find a single place like that.
911, what is your emergency?
I was just working in the Department of Justice. Gun control advocates and Democrats will fight you tooth and nail. They want to go and say we've stopped 3.5 million dangerous people.
Okay, is anybody injured? Yes, a lot of blood. Please help, please.
I look at it as we've stopped 3.5 million law-abiding citizens who wanted to get a gun.
Are you in the school? Where are you in the school? Well, on the first floor. They were shooting into my classroom.
Anyway, congratulations on an amazing accomplishment. You know, I'm sure all of you will have a very bright future ahead. Thank you very much.
That was John Lott Jr., who was considered the Bible of the gun rights movement, speaking at the fake graduation ceremony in Las Vegas, of course, where there was another massacre that took place a few years ago that killed scores of people. And by the way, BuzzFeed contacted Mr. Lott. He said, "You're telling me the whole thing was a setup?" He said, "No, I didn't know that." So, Manuel, where were you and Patricia, your wife, Joaquin's parents, when all this was happening?
We were right there. I mean, you have to also understand that this guy, his best accomplishment is that he wrote a book that is called More Guns, Less Crime. So that's the kind of person that is trying to, after all this happened, trying to protect himself behind the fact that we played with his words or whatever. We were right there. We were not allowed to be seen because probably someone could recognize our faces. So we were inside a trailer home next to the stage, watching everything and making sure that everything was with a huge team that helped us here, making sure that every single detail was coming out the way that we planned it.
One of the spokespeople for Change the Ref, your group, said, ironically, had the men conducted a proper background check on the school, they would have seen that the school is fake. Talk about calling it James Madison High School.
Well, we needed to bring the reality behind the gun big picture. Let's put everything together to make it very legit. And the fact that these guys were invited to become speakers in James Madison School, who is the guy that wrote down the Second Amendment, that will be a reason to be there. And it worked. So and again, this is more than how we did this and bragging about the way that we were able to bring these two influencers from the gun.
You made a website.
Lobby. Yeah, we made a website.
Of the fake school.
Correct. We made a website, and they went into the website. If you go deep into the website, you will see that that school was only working since April, so that's a red flag. But the egos of these people are beyond that. You know, they just wanted, let's go to Vegas, spend the weekend. It's everything ties together just like we planned it.
Manny, we just have 1 minute. And of course, it's graduation season all over the country. You've shown the more than 3,000 chairs of kids who won't graduate from high school because of gun violence. President Biden just gave a major speech on gun violence. Do you think the Biden administration is doing enough? We're having a little trouble hearing you. Your sound is dropping out. We're talking to Manuel Oliver, who is co-founder of the gun reform group Change the Ref. His son, Joaquin, was one of 17 people killed in the 2018 mass shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. If you want to see the full images of this event that he organized in Las Vegas to demonstrate the loss, the pain, the horror of gun violence, you can go to democracynow.org. Manny, we have 15 seconds for your final comment on is enough being done.
We need to, it's the addition of different things. It's not only what President Biden is trying to do. It's not only what some leaders are trying to do. It's what we are trying to do, what the youth is trying to do. All those things together are bringing these conversations. We are having a conversation with no need of a mass shooting for you to call me. And that's advancing in the fight against gun violence.
We thank you so much, and our best to you and Patricia. Manuel Oliver, thank you. This is Democracy Now! As we wrap up, stay safe. Special thanks to our whole team here at Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.